from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today, we're going to end a 6-week series that we've been bringing you on the topic an affair with the arts and humanities. For our viewers who haven't been with us over the past few weeks, we've been very fortunate at North Idaho College to celebrate the 25th anniversary of what is known as the North Idaho College Popcorn Forum, which is our lecture series. And during those days of that symposium, we've had some very distinguished guests dealing with the fine arts and with all areas of the arts as well as the humanities. On our 6th and final program, we have a very, very dramatic topic to talk about. We brought during that week to our campus a play called Camp Logan. That play is about a group of black soldiers in World War I that were tried for mutiny in 1917. It is a very, very dramatic production. It is based on 1,200 pages of a transcript of the trial, and for many, many years little was known, and this evolved into a book, and then others that were not associated with the book have created this play. I'm happy to report that it is premiering here in the Northwest for the first time due to the fact that we had this lecture series, and we're grateful to the company for coming with this very serious and very important topic to our region, the United States. Yet this group has performed at many universities and colleges and military bases and at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. Our guest to talk about Camp Logan is Mike Celeste, who is the co-producer of Camp Logan. He is a private investigator in San Antonio, Texas, usually working, I believe, for the Defense Council, and he is on the road with Camp Logan for this trip. Mike, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. We thank you for bringing the company here, and we look forward to talking about this very, very important subject as we close out this 6-week series on our program.
Well, I'm glad to be here. It reinforces our feeling that we can work in just any region. The only reason we haven't been here yet is just because of geographics.
Yes, and well, thank you for accepting our invitation. I would add, too, that Tim Rarick, who's on the panel today, and Katie Manns on our staff deserve the credit for knowing about you and the invitation. I welcome to the panel, first of all, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Shink, who is Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and from the faculty in the Drama Department of North Idaho College, Tim Rarick. And I shall ask Janelle to commence our questioning.
For the information of our viewers, Mike, can you tell us, what is Camp Logan?
It's the best play that nobody knows about. It is based on the largest mutiny in armed forces history, which resulted in the largest court-martial in U.S. history. It was a landmark decision in constitutional law because it changed the way that military death sentences were reviewed from military review to presidential review. But the government sealed the records for about 50 years, so people who have heard anything about it at all, they really don't know too much about it. And in Houston and San Antonio, it was oral history because the mutiny took place in Houston and the court-martial and execution of these soldiers took place in San Antonio. So I heard the story growing up as a young child, and the author, who is a black playwright from Houston, Celeste Walker, she heard the Houston part of it growing up. I didn't know much about how Houston had gone down, and she didn't know anything about how San Antonio had gone. She didn't know much about the court-martial and execution, but she knew about the mutiny.
Actually, how many soldiers were court-martialed and eventually
There were 3
executed?
court-martials. The first one was the largest. There were 63 black enlisted men. They had 1 defense counsel who was not an attorney. He had 10 days to prepare for trial. Out of that group, 13 were executed and 45 got life sentences at Leavenworth. And their case did not go up on appeal till 3 months after they were executed.
Amazing.
Steve Sheen.
What was there any eventual outcome as time went by? You said there was a large number of soldiers who received life sentences at Leavenworth. Any of those cases reviewed, any of those sentences commuted or shortened in any way?
None of them served longer than 20 years. By 1937, they had all been released. in one form or another. And some did serve as long as 20 years. The Army sent psychiatrists and psychologists to Leavenworth for about 8 years to interview these guys, find out how that happened, when they didn't want that to happen again, you know, all of that. But these men were model prisoners. They were not, they were soldiers. They were not criminals. They were members of a Buffalo Soldier regiment that started in 1866, 24th Infantry. They had served for 20 years in the West Texas, settling the American West. They'd served in Cuba. They saved Teddy Roosevelt's butt at San Juan Hill.
This was an all-black regiment.
Yes,
which
with
was
white
common
officers.
At that point in time.
Well, I don't know about common. There were 4 of them. There were 2 cavalry and 2 infantry in the whole U.S. forces. But on the frontier overseas, they were the ones that did the heavy duty.
Well,
in the Philippines, in Cuba, and they had just come back from serving in Mexico with Pershing. The 24th Infantry was responsible for the integrity of Pershing's supply lines into Mexico for 300 miles. They were tough. They were the best soldiers we had. They thought they were going to France. They stopped off in Houston to guard the construction site of an Army camp, Camp Logan. And in less than 3 weeks, a group of about 120 of them mutinied, marched into Houston to take revenge on the Houston Civil Police because of the enforcement, of the type of enforcement that they came in contact with the Jim Crow laws of Houston.
Explain that for us just a little bit more, if you would, please.
Well, they come from areas on the frontier overseas where they were not used to being discriminated against that much. I mean, they were soldiers first and they were black second. In Houston, they were niggers first and they were soldiers second. And nobody in Houston wanted black soldiers. They're armed black soldiers. They didn't want them there. The Houston police didn't want them. The Houston citizens didn't want them. The Army sent them there anyway because that was convenient at the time to do that for whatever reason. Sometimes the Army sent units, black units, into areas because they felt there was an immunity to tropical diseases. There was no mosquito control in Houston at that time. And that was one of the reasons some of these men had offered themselves in the yellow fever camps in Siboney, Cuba during the Spanish-American War when the white soldiers were dying from yellow fever. There was some reason that was one of the reasons they went to Houston.
So the uprising was largely not against military authority, but against civilian authority.
It was against civilian authority, but
Yep.
but they had to override military authority to get into Houston. I mean, that night, the night of the mutiny, the military attempted to take up all the weapons of the soldiers, and this particular group didn't give up their weapons.
Explain to us a little, if you would, please, just what kind of treatment led to such a response from these soldiers.
You know, you try to put your finger on, what there was one thing or another, but I think the main thing was that the black MPs were not allowed to carry firearms, and so they couldn't handle the soldiers in town. The white civil police were given the authority and the control over the black soldiers rather than the black MPs, which was usually the case. The soldiers were used to authority from black MPs, but they were not used to authority from... There was a special force in Houston, a mounted group of men that were specifically enforcing the laws in the Negro section of town. They called it the colored section, the black section of town, and a couple of these guys were... One of them had already been, had already killed 2 black civilians by the time the soldiers got there, and it had a reputation. And it didn't take long, for them to start having some conflicts. They had conflicts on the trolley cars that were, they would pile into the white section of the trolley car, and they'd have confrontations with trolley car conductors. They had confrontations with white construction workers on the construction site because the water barrels were segregated, and the soldiers weren't used to that. They'd just go drink out of the white water barrel, and the white construction workers, they get into fights about that. It didn't take too long. But there was they separated the regiment when they moved the troops to Houston. They only sent 1 battalion. They didn't have a full complement of officers. a lot of the best non-commissioned officers had been taken out of the unit and sent to Iowa for the first black officers training school. So there was a lack of leadership there that they didn't normally have. And then when you pile this on top of that, you end up with what you had.
Tim Rarick.
Well, I'm interested in shifting from the content for just a minute to the author. You say that this material lay dormant for a long time. So how did Celeste Walker, how did she come in contact with this, and how did it evolve into the play?
Well, she's the daughter of a black soldier and the granddaughter of a black soldier. Her father and grandfather were in the military, so she had a feel for the black military experience. She says, as a child growing up in Houston, whenever there was a racial incident in Houston, some of the older folks would say, well, this kind of puts me in the mind of Camp Logan. Then they'd kind of fade off. They wouldn't really talk about it. So it kind of piqued her interest. And then she, grew up to be a playwright. I mean, she didn't, this isn't the first play she wrote. I mean, she'd been a playwright. She's been a playwright for over 20 years. But Camp Logan is something that just kept coming back to her. And it just was something she decided she wanted to try to write, to tell the men's side of it. And some of the characters she developed, not knowing the real history about some of these men. After she found out some of the history about some of the individuals, her characters sort of actually fit in with some of the real life people that she eventually found out about. But she wrote the characters pretty much not knowing too much about the men themselves.
Well, it sounds like it's at its core a play about indignity and injustice. Is that the kind of response you're getting from audiences as you go around the United States? Is that what they respond to?
Well, they respond to theater people respond to the theater, just it's good theater. That's one of the responses that we find. The reviewers who review the play, they in their review they get into the subject matter, but then they also talk about the theatricality of it, the drama of it. But we also have gotten a lot of good response because of the curriculum that it provides. Different institutions, the military institutions, the colleges and universities, the cultural centers. It cuts across a lot of age lines and race lines as far as audience. So we get a lot of different response. Mm-hmm. A lot of Buffalo soldiers who retired in the Fort Leavenworth area came to see the show at Kansas City with their old uniforms on and brought their families, that kind of thing.
Mike, we briefly mentioned on the program a few minutes ago that there was a certain procedure that was used for military trials that could also result in execution, as it did in this case, and that because of what happened in this case, that the whole procedure was changed. What I'd like for you to do in more specifics for the viewers is explain how the procedure was at the time that Camp Logan took place, and then the exact way the change
well, it was
affected the process.
In those days, military indictments were pretty basic, and what these men were charged with was murder and mutiny during time of war. Both were acts that were punishable by hanging, which was one way of carrying out the death sentence. They also had firing squads, but what they did was not a firing squad offense. It was a hanging offense, which is more ignominious than death by firing squad. They felt more. They requested that they be shot by firing squad. More soldierly. But at that time, there was no civilian review of military death sentences in this country.
So there was a panel that heard.
There was a 13-group court-martial, about 7 generals and 6 colonels from the Southern District heard the case. The review consisted of reading at the end of each day the transcript, and that was reviewed. In military law at that time, there really wasn't much opportunity for a defendant to even say anything in mitigating circumstances. Basically, you did this and that's it. They had one defense counsel. They did not communicate with their defense counsel, and none of them testified. They all pled not guilty. But it was during time of war. We just gotten into the war in April, and we were real nervous about Mexico at that time. The Army didn't want to spend a lot of time on this, but they did want to control it. The state of Texas would like to have been the one to prosecute these guys. They tried to do it, and DA in Houston wanted the case. And he actually sat at the prosecution table at the court-martial. But at the end of the first trial, 13 of these men were executed, and their case did go up on appeal actually to the Adjutant General of the Army 3 months later. Well, it did cause some commotion in Washington, and Congress did change the law in 1918 in January. These men were executed in December of 1917. And the law required presidential review of military death sentences after that. And there were 2 more court-martials in 1918, and they sentenced 16 more to be executed, and Wilson commuted 10 of those sentences, but 6 more were executed in 1918. And that eventually led step by step to the Court of Military Appeals, but it took about 30 years.
Counting all the men that were executed and those that weren't, what were the total number that were found guilty?
Out of approximately 120, I think only 5 were acquitted.
Janelle Burke.
We certainly learn from history, and also with art, it's a way of learning about something. How is Camp Logan relevant to life today? What kinds of lessons do you think we learned from Camp Logan?
Well, it's pretty obvious. I mean, it's like we didn't stage Rodney King, but it made a difference when we went to Los Angeles. You can see it all around, the racial intolerance. I think 1995 is a lot like 1917 with the dissolving of the Soviet Union and everybody getting back to the 1917 type borders in the Balkans, and you see the religious intolerance. 1917 everything's just sort of frozen, Muslim, Christian, and now you see that unfrozen. I mean, you can't legislate tolerance, internationally or nationally or state, can't do it.
So as people
you got to teach it, you got to learn it. You got to learn tolerance.
As people come to view Camp Logan, that's what you're hoping to. That's the message you're hoping.
Well,
to
no, we
convey.
didn't send it that. We didn't do it like that. I hope to make a film out of it. That's what I started doing, and I ran across the play. And to me, the play was the way to the film. I didn't see the film as a way of sending a message of racial tolerance out there. I saw it as a good movie. I saw it as the first movie about blacks in the military. But since I tried to start working on it, the movie Soldier Story came along. The movie Glory came along, and we're just getting better chance to be a film. But I saw it as a combination of The Wild Bunch, Breaker Morant, and the movie Soldier Story, and I just saw it as a good film. I wasn't on a crusade particularly, but you can't get away from what it is. Yeah.
And you've traveled all over the United States with us, haven't you?
We've,
Can you tell us a few of the places you've been?
We've been to Harvard, been to Wellesley, we've been to historically black colleges, we've been to hardcore military installations like Fort Bragg, Fort Knox, Fort Campbell, Kentucky, been to Air Force bases, naval stations. We've been to performing arts centers like the Kennedy Center. We did a 5-week run in Harlem, just down the street from the Apollo last summer. We've gotten reviews from every major paper that every place we've ever been: Boston Globe, New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune. But it's theater. It's slow. It's word of mouth. You can only get, audiences are small. People aren't used to going to theater. They've gotten away from going out at all much. And we've had some very small audiences. We've had some huge audiences. You never know for sure. It just depends on the promoter, the presenter, and how it's presented to the community. How many sponsors in the community, get involved. At military installations, that's good, because they make a lot of guys show up.
Steve Sheen.
But they've taped the play in the military, and they use it on military installation bases on closed-circuit TV for curriculum during African American Heritage Month.
Mike, I'm going to bounce around a little bit on my next round of questioning, but there are some things that just pop into my head, and I've got to get them answered. How in the world did a guy who is a private investigator set out to make a movie out of Camp Logan and then end up as a co-producer and agent for the theatrical production of that story?
Because I was interested in finding out how to make it happen. I've been investigating ways to get this done.
Well,
I look at it like a case. And you're an attorney, right? You know how you have preliminary hearings? And we've had a lot of preliminary hearings in the last 4 years. Every time we put the play on, it's a preliminary hearing. You know, when this hopefully film gets into the wider audience that film can get to, that'll be the trial. You know, but at each stage of it, I've had to investigate. Like I was telling Tim, you know, I didn't know about performing arts booking conferences. You know, I just found out about them and started going to them and taking a display there and talking to people about the play. You know, I feel like I've heard about guys selling their records out of the back of their car, you know. That's what I feel like I've been doing.
Here's another totally disjointed question for you, but it's occurred to me a couple of times as the questioning has gone around that we had, 19 men executed? And many
about
more.
75 got life sentences.
Many more than that sentenced to life imprisonment. The actual confrontation between the troops and the militia in Houston. How many died?
No contest. They killed 20 whites, including 5 Houston police officers, and they suffered no casualties.
All right. They
were black. It was at night. It was in August. It was raining and foggy. They were professional soldiers. They had state-of-the-art technology at that time. The Springfield 03 rifle was state-of-the-art infantry weapon. They were organized. They were on a mission, and they quit of their own accord. Nobody stopped them. They went back to camp by themselves. And the reason they did that is because after about 2.5 hours of this, military personnel started getting involved, white military personnel from the Illinois National Guard. And when they started getting into combat with them and they killed a few of the Illinois National Guard and realized they were killing U.S. soldiers, they quit.
Tim,
it's the only race riot in U.S. history where more whites were killed than blacks.
I'm interested in the presentation that you made at the Kennedy Center and how that changed your perception of what was out there. That must have been a unique experience.
Yes, because I'm not from that world, and so I wasn't as in awe of it. It was just a place where I thought we should be, because we'd been to military installations in the D.C. area, and we'd been kind of around the D.C. area. I knew there was a market there for it, but I didn't know about the Kennedy Center and what they did. But it so happened there was a performing arts festival from Texas that was being put together by a group of people in Texas, financed by some oil companies, Exxon, and they like to throw a lot of money at the arts sometimes. And we sent in an application to it. By then we were on the Texas Arts Council touring roster, and we had some reviews behind us and some credibility. And they sent somebody to see the show, and this guy saw the show, and he told them, you need to have Camp Logan as part of this festival. So we ended up being the only play from Texas there. They had, like the Houston Ballet and the Dallas Symphony and Willie Nelson and all of these, the Texas Tornado, Freddie Fender, all those great guys. And they had Camp Logan.
Well, on the other hand, you must have run into some awfully unusual situations too. I'm interested in one of the places that you performed that was really challenging. Where would that be? Really challenging?
It was the NCO club one at Fort Langley, where they had a dinner type thing. Everybody was seated at tables with drinks and stuff. And our dressing room was a storage closet behind the stage with a little gas heater. It was real cold in February, That was one that comes to mind pretty, sticks out a lot. We did it for a church group as a fundraiser, and they had their meal at the intermission, and everybody brought their dinner back to the tables, for the second act. And they did stop eating during the hanging scene. I actually didn't hear any clinking and forks and stuff at the end during the hanging scene, but the rest of the time it was just having a meal and watching the show. They didn't know that much about theater, I guess. I don't know. But You know, the actors take it, you know, they have to have a sense of humor. I mean, especially being on the road like we are. We did, February '94, we did 26 shows in 6 weeks in 11 states, coast to coast, you know, with 2 vans and a U-Haul trailer. And there's a lot of togetherness, a lot of bonding.
Yeah.
We're getting a little short on time, but before the show, you and I were talking, Mike, about Mr. Goldbeck, I believe, that you interviewed.
Photographer, yes.
Yes, at age 96, I believe. Tell us how that interview and your investigation fits into the Camp Logan story.
Well, he was someone who happened to be from San Antonio, but he was a world-known photographer, traveled everywhere in the world, and developed this panoramic style of photography. And I was just in his office looking for some old photographs of the police department in San Antonio. I'd been a police officer there. And I came across this photo of the original burial site of these soldiers that he had taken in 1918. And it caught my attention, and I started asking him about it, and he said it wasn't there anymore, that they'd removed it when they moved the graves to the National Cemetery at Fort Sam Houston. And when I went there to see the graves, the curator of the cemetery had a copy of the original order from 1937 where the graves were removed. And I actually saw the names of these individuals. That was the first time there sort of a connection, you know, was made, or that there was more than just, you know, nobody you could even put a name to. And it just piqued, you know, my curiosity and made me want to find out more about it. And I'm a law school dropout. I was interested in it from a legal standpoint. I do a lot of criminal defense work in Texas, and it's a capital state. I've worked on some capital cases, and so it was sort of interesting to me. That it was like an avocation. It was something just, you know, I did, you know, like collecting stamps or something for a while. Was collecting information about Camp Logan.
You indicated that all the people who were given sentences, I believe, have been released.
By 1937. Mm-hmm.
Are some of those individuals still alive?
We haven't run across anybody. I ran across a son of one of the men whose death sentences was commuted at a reunion. The 24th Infantry was the last segregated regiment of the armed forces. They were phased out in Korea in 1950, and they have alumni associations around the country, and when we go to cities, they come see the show. We went to their reunion and I met this one individual, like I said. We met family members, but you know, these guys, they'd be in their 90s by now, most of them.
On that note, I have to bring the program to conclusion. On behalf of our 3 members of the panel and our staff, Mike, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a most interesting and informative program, and thank you for bringing Camp Logan to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and to North Idaho College. And good luck to you in your future and the film itself.
Thanks a lot.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Mike Celeste, who is the co-producer of Camp Logan. This brings our 6-week series on the arts and humanities to a close, and we'll be with you again next week to talk about yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.